Good
Got
evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cashmere Goat Association's presentation. It's tonight, part A on fiber assessment. That is going to be presented by, I'm going to say Dr. Peter Goth, although he does not like us to use doctor when we're talking to him in the goat world. But you do need to know that his profession is as a doctor, and actually he just got back from an award tonight, and I know he wouldn't tell you that either because he's one of the most humble people that I've met. So Dr. Goth is, has two lives, his life in the medical world where he's done amazing things that will be recorded forever, but more importantly, he's done some incredible things for the Cashmere goat world that we felt as an association we need to get him here and recorded for a presentation for not only future judges, but for those that want to learn firsthand about how to assess their own fiber. So tonight's program by Peter is going to be divided up into two parts. He'll have the main screen and he has a presentation all ready to go. Questions can be put in the chat, but there is going to be a pause on part one, a little break and intermission where I will cue you to ask your question because Peter likes to have more of an engaging interaction for this program. So I'll ask you to address the questions, and we'll have a little break at the end of part one and then another break at part two. If there are too many questions, then we'll just hold them to the very end. You all will be receiving a recording of this. It may not be the exact recording. We have someone that's going to be kind of doctoring it up and making it look a lot prettier and a little more professional. So, but you all will receive a recording of this. So without much more time being taken on my end, I'd like to introduce Peter. And thank you, Peter, for being here. You have spent a tremendous amount of time putting this presentation together.
Well, that's what I do. So let's get going. Okay. Well, let's get started. Wendy will be here in a bit too. And she and I have worked on this together for about 25 years, I think. So here we are after 25 years. Let's go through part A, which is really what cashmere is and what it isn't, and how it relates to other kinds of fibers. Yeah, and then part of that will lead into why we have a standard and a registry and a breed even, and what the criteria are for that. That's where we take a break. Then the next part will be what each of those terms means. And I think there's a great opportunity to clarify a lot of this stuff, I think, in that part too. It's plenty of time, not only for questions, but comments, suggestions, good ideas. It just doesn't have to be a question. We'll have two spots for that. Are you ready to go, Christine? You think?
Yes, we are ready to go. Everybody is muted and listening. Thank you.
All right. Here we go. So this is our first session of 3. And on this one, we'll be talking about the cashmere fiber, not so much as a garment, but cashmere fiber as it relates to the goat. This is a sort of a unfamous publication that was produced back about 25 years ago. It came out of Mongolia, and it really represents the original some of the first science that they did in that area regarding what cashmere is and isn't. We actually have got the last copy probably in the world. I would love to see CGA republish this, but let's move on. These are the original line of cashmere goats that came out of Asia. So when you think of cashmere in the Himalayas and that part of China and that part of India and that part of Mongolia, they're all kind of a similar, in a similar place, and they share the same climates. And these are the goats, the original cashmere that comes out of them. These are pretty stout, big boys. Here's another view. 20% of these, by the way, don't have horns. That's interesting. Most of them are kind of a laid back horn that you see in the black goat on the bottom. But this this pokey type up here is a pretty unusual. Don't probably never see that again, but I think you get the idea that these are really long-haired animals, and the ones that we've seen ourselves in that part of the country for real have really had big bushy coats. They've all been long-haired goats with just tons of fiber. So that's the original. Let's talk a little bit about what the cashmere fibers are. Really, on a cashmere goat, you have three kinds of fiber. The cashmere fiber is basically a solid fiber. It's got an inner orthocortex, paracortex. The way those line up is what causes the crimp, because one slides on the other. What's interesting about those, the scale cells that overlap will slide as well. These are small, fine scale cells on a on a central cortex that is asymmetric, and that's what causes the crimp. The guard hair has an outer layer, a cortex layer, but the third part of it, what they call the medulla, is really full of air. It's like a honeycomb full of air, and we'll see what that means in some pictures. The intermediate fiber is something to pay attention to. This thing is a problem. What that is over time in some breeding programs trying to get more in the way of down, we found that in Mongolia in particular, they found that they were getting kind of a combination fiber. So it wasn't guard hair and it wasn't cashmere or down. It was something that was a combination. I'll show you what that means and why it's important. So this is what the cashmere overlapping cuticle on the outside cells look like. And it's the internal part of this that is asymmetric inside the cuticle that causes the crimp. This is what guard hair looks, very different. It's got sort of a honeycomb of construction inside, and these honeycombs are actually filled with air cells, and a lot like deer cells hair, and these hairs float. Okay, so it's almost like a foam or an air spaces. The third type of fiber is a combination of the two, and we try not to have that at all in cashmere, but we're finding that over time that is invaded some of the cashmere breeding programs. So can you see how the intermediate fiber looks like a perfectly fine cashmere, and then it just turns into something else and essentially turns into part guard hair. What's the difference? Well, why is this important? We'll get to that in a minute, but that's what an intermediate fiber is. It has characteristics of both. This is really bad to have on your goats, and we'll show you why. I thought this was kind of interesting, that look at the relative diameters of things like cashmere. 14 to 16.5, we would call that premium cashmere worldwide. But look where everything else is way above that, well above that. Notably, mohair, which is Angora, see how heavy that is, the second one down, 23 to 45 microns. That's a very heavy fiber. It's more almost like human hair. But that's what mohair is, comes out of Angora. Note that vicuña is really fine. You see that, but it's too short to really be very useful. We'll see that short hairs, as we go on, will actually pull out of the fiber over time and cause a garment to pill. It also is just about impossible to spin. To say the only way you can get vicuña fiber is to catch them, and you can't catch them. So we won't worry too much that vicuña is slightly more fine than cashmere, because it's irrelevant. So years ago, we're kind of finishing up this section. We talked about, well, we've been building this up gradually over decades at Cashmere Goat Association. In the decades ago, a lot of people raised what we would call cashmere goats, but we really couldn't tell if we had a good goat or a bad goat, or even what good cashmere was or wasn't. Maybe we could do good cashmere, but we certainly couldn't do what a good cashmere goat was, because we just had no goal. We had no standard. In fact, Wendy and I at one point got kind of frustrated. This answered an ad in the newspaper around the state for cashmere goats, went and found 3 of them that were advertised, farms that were advertising cashmere goats, and not a one of them had cashmere on them. They were big, hairy goats with no cashmere. So cashmere has become like a buzzword that means something of quality and fiber, but I think we can do better than that. So that's why we started working on a standard for cashmere that went a little bit beyond the international standard, and developing a registry for it, and that led to a breed. So let's take a look here. The legal definition is on that first check mark. Can you guys see this okay? Does that work all right? Okay. So the first check mark is there a legal definition? Yes, there is. The Wool Products Labeling Act through the Federal Trade Commission. This is an international standard accepted by all countries. So there's no argument. And you have the CCMI. They are essentially the cashmere police around the world. So if something is labeled cashmere, they go in, take it apart, and find out if the cashmere is actually 19 microns or less, and if it is 24% or less, or coefficient of variation is 24% or less. That's the uniformity it's got to have. If not, they can't call it cashmere, and they actually take legal action to make that happen. So it's kind of neat. We have a guard dog in the industry worldwide, and we've talked to these folks. That's what they do. They go purchase stuff off the shelf, and if Saks Fifth Avenue is selling something they call cashmere and it isn't, we do have an international standard, and they force them to take it off the market. Does that make sense? Get that? It's good to have a guard dog on your side. Let's go to the next check mark. Do all goats have cashmere? You've heard people say that. No, they don't. They all have down. They all have an underlying secondary follicle under the guard hair, which sheds every year, but it is not always cashmere. Note that dogs have down, camel have down, horses have down. Your dog will shed in the spring, but it's not cashmere, it's a secondary follicle. So to say that all goats have, boar goats have an underlying secondary follicle, but I've never seen a boar goat with cashmere, but they, by international standard, but they do have fuzzy down underneath the guard hair, which they shed. All right. So why would we care about doing something that's a little more than the CCMI's international standard? Let's take length, for example. Worldwide, there is no length standard for cashmere. So when some of the cashmere coming out of China, for example, is really fine, but it may be something like 3/4 of an inch or 19 microns. That is really a problem when it comes to spinning it and when it comes to pilling of the garment. So when we were putting together the idea of some standards for what we would try to do here in North America and make all the standards relevant to quality. So the international standard, 19 microns and 24% coefficient of variation, that's okay, but we wanted to make the length something that would be a working length that would be valuable. And it has been valuable. Going to 1.25 inches or 32 microns makes it very easy to spin, and also it resists pilling. Okay. A cashmere bearing goat, you'll hear that kind of thing. At some point in his life doesn't mean he still has it. Let's move on. If you're going to talk about an ideal cashmere goat, you would want to look at something besides just the hair. for example, can this animal survive? Is it a, is it a dual purpose animal really? And yes, it is. So we have to look at the teeth, the hooves, and the reproductive structures. So when we're looking at a standard, we weren't just looking at fiber. If we wanted to have a real standard, we were looking at fiber and conformation together. Okay, this will come together in something like a scorecard in a bit. So that's how we got involved with making a standard for a really good cashmere goat that included international standards, plus some that we were defining as North American cashmere goat standard. If you then have a registry for tracking these standards on goats, then you have a breed. So you need a standard and a way to track it, and you have a breed. What's the difference between that and a breed? Nothing. That is a breed. And in the early days, we were having problems with people where it seemed to be confusing that we had these really nice goats with really good cashmere and reproducible. There was a standard and a way of grading that standard and a registry for registering the standard meeting goats. Why didn't we call it a breed? So we've done everything to call it a breed. What had to happen was actually Eastern Cashmere Association became the Cashmere Goat Association, which we now have, and they stood up and said, we declare that that is a breed. It's a breed. This is good. So let's take a look at what we have on our webpage as the current Cashmere Goat Association sponsored North American Cashmere Goat Breed Standard. When I say North America, I really mean it. We went to all of the cashmere organizations throughout the Northwest, Texas, Canada. And when we talked about the North American Cashmere Goat, we wanted to make it we thought maybe the American Cashmere Goat would be a way to do. And then we got into some discussions with the Canadians about manifest destiny. And they thought, no, we can't call it that. We have to call it North American Cashmere Goat. And wonderful, love to have them in. So when we looked at these standards, what we did is put together we looked at the Canadian one, the Northwestern, and kind of came to a consensus of what everybody agreed on as far as what the standard should be. And we called it the North American Cashmere Goat Breed Standard, as sponsored by CGA. So basically it's considered 50% fiber, 50% conformation as far as value. So a true dual purpose goat. And it's got 7 fiber traits and 7 conformation traits. I'm going to run through those real quick, and then we'll take some questions on it, and then we'll put all of these in more detail, at least for the fiber today. So diameter, 19 microns or less. Uniformity, we'll talk about that, 24% CV or less. Style, we used to measure it as 45 degrees of an arc or less. We'll talk about that. That's now how we do that. Length, this is not found in international standards. And we talk to people from Italy in particular and Europe, they are going, why don't they do that too? So it may be, but it's interesting that the Europeans don't measure length at all. Some of the finest cashmere you find at Saks Fifth Avenue. It happens to have good length, but they don't require it. And when you go to we've looked at some of the cashmere that's come in around the world, particularly from Asia, and a lot of that is like 3/4 of an inch. So I think the fact that we have length in there is a big deal. Differentiation, the guard hair should be different from the down for reasons we'll talk about. Total down weight should be something like 2 ounces or more. That's kind of a minimum. And then we'll talk about cover on the goat needs to be consistent and complete. Those are the fiber characteristics. There's 7 of them. Essentially, we'll get to this in the next one, but there's also 7 traits of conformation. So can you see how that's a 50-50 type of animal? It's a dual purpose animal. It's a meat animal and a fiber animal, 50-50. And then we put together a grading system to be able to evaluate those 7 and 7 traits. And it looks like this. This may sound a little silly, but why 0 to 3? Okay, disqualified up to excellent. And you could put decimals in the middle. The idea is that this would kind of get away from sort of like medium plus or excellent minus or course plus plus. And we were seeing a lot of that when people tried to evaluate fiber. So if you're going to say it's medium plus, somewhere between medium and excellent, why don't you say 2.5? So that's one way of doing it. There can be decimals in between that are just another way of you communicating what you're saying, but it seems a little more precise. And many of our judges now are able to do that quite easily. So there's a 0 to 3, and out west, it's interesting. In the Northwest, we had on either side of the Mississippi, we were exactly opposite in what 0 to 3 meant. So for fineness, MFD, 3 was the best score, but for style, it was the other way around. Can you see how it would be real nice to clean this up and have one unified standard? So that's what we have now. So it's no matter what side of the Mississippi you're on, everybody agrees 0 is really bad, 3 is the best, and you can put decimals in there if you want. You can still use words if you like to do that, and you can still use absolute objective data. For example, on fiber, you can do micron measurements on a histogram with laser scanning, and Texas A&M is doing that now. So there's 3 ways you can evaluate each of these traits. Make sense? Still on it? Okay. So coming out of that, here's what we have today is a breed standard scorecard. We use this in shows because we're, this is for simply evaluating the 7 traits of fiber and 7 traits of conformation. That's a scorecard. Notice that the 3 check marks up here are the ones that are required to get in the North American Cashmere Goat registry. So they're super important. You've got to have the rest. All these other traits are scored, but they go on your database. So people buying and selling cashmere goats and with North American cashmere goats can look at the registry and see all of these things, but they're not. If you don't have really good differentiation, for example, you can still be registered as North American Cashmere Goat, but you might not have the best differentiation score. And people buying and selling will be able to see that. More on this as we move along. You'll see how that works. And the next thing we did was added to the scorecard for shows with the traits that are scored. There are other characteristics that are really important in a breeding system or in a breeding program that need to be defined and clarified, but they really don't get scored. For example, down to guard hair ratio or the length of guard hair. The length of guard hair, we couldn't find any consensus on that. There are reasons for some places to have long guard hair, some to have short. So we just left it as an information piece that would be evaluated. And this kind of evaluation is what you would be doing on an on-farm evaluation for trying to help somebody's or your own breeding program. So it's not required to score, but it's required to, and it's not even required in the registry. But if you're scoring on farm, you can see how condition and frame could be important. One of the reasons frame isn't in a North American Cashmere Goat standard, we just couldn't get people to agree around Canada and the US whether or not a big frame was a good thing or not. And Wendy and I happen to like really big goats if we can. But some people really didn't want to have a big goat. So there was no consensus. Okay, it goes into information. It's a breeder's preference, but it gets listed in the grading system when you're trying to evaluate your own goats or on somebody else's farm. All right, let's stop right there. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? Christine, you okay with that?
Yeah, we do not have any questions, but if anybody wants Peter to back up and go over any specifics, please, now would be a good time to ask your question.
What we're going to do is go through all of these scored fiber traits, and conformation will be deferred. We'll go through all of the things that are involved with fiber in the next session, or this right to follow.
I'm kind of late, so I missed a bunch.
You missed the what?
I missed the first 26 minutes because my computer wouldn't respond.
Eeks. We will have this. This is all recorded, and you'll be able to get this this whole show essentially.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Sorry. If you had a goat that passed the diameter, uniformity, and length, but let's say had like a 1 score for all of conformation, would it still be able to be put in the registry?
Yes. Yes, it's not a disqualifier, but it should be put into the registry anyway, because that kind of information is what you would want to know if you're getting a good goat or not goat. So that's why they're still scored, but it doesn't disqualify you. So you might have a real North American Cashmere goat, but it might not be so good on something like hooves and teeth. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
That's the difference between a required, those 3 checks up here, and scored. The requireds are scored, but they're required. The rest are scored, but they're not required to be registered. What this allows is a lot of improvement over time in your own breeding program by evaluating all these things and continuing to trade up as you cull your stock or buy and sell new goats. And what's really happened by being able to do this, we found huge differences in, for example, the fiber out west, like in Colorado. I remember 15 years ago, I don't know if anybody here is from out west, but when Wendy and I have been judging out there for a couple decades now, and early on, they had these big meat goat type goats, and their fiber was really not good. Now that we have a standard that they've been working on with a grading system, and they're doing it in a 4-H program, so a lot of attention on this, they've been able to improve their fiber like dramatically just by having these scored and kept in a registry. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next then.
May I say something?
Yes, you sure may.
I'm in California and our goats are comparable to yours.
Are the California goats comparable, you say?
No, our goats out here are comparable to yours. They look just the same now.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, out west, the goats they're sort of becoming more and more similar. We're going to see a lot of pictures of these things as we go forward.
Well, I'm putting the New Zealand lines into mine and they're looking really nice.
Yeah, well, New Zealand and Australia do have some goats. Well, stay tuned. We're kind of coming up with some of that about how you can go different ways with different ways of breeding, but there still can be a North American Cashmere goat. All right, you're in California, you say, Ron?
Well, I'm Barbara, but yeah, we're in California.
Ron is your husband, or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Well, let's take a look at some of these. You ready for part 2? We can take a look at some of these in more detail. So this is the overall, put it all together. You see 7 traits of fiber, 7 traits of conformation, and some information like in the 2 blue checks. We're going to go through that in this next session, all the things that involve fiber. So here we go. Let's talk about color. Let me just say, color kind of years ago, we used to make a big thing about different colors of down and guard hair and all that. What really happens when you send your fiber in for processing, it really basically more or less goes into 3 bins. You've got a white, a dark brown, and taupe. And taupe is gray and brown mixed. So an awful lot of stuff goes into taupe. And so really, there's no real need to get too specific about color. And so what we found is, why don't we just leave it as a breeder preference? So instead of having 14 different types of color, just whatever you want is color. There's no requirement, but we leave that as general information. If you like to have big silver goats, or if you like to have black goats, you can do that, but it's not required one way or the other. We do list it, and it's not even scored. You okay with that? Questions on that? All right. Remember, when we made any of these things to be scored or not, it was done through a total consensus of North America, including Canada and out west. Let's talk about guard hair length. One way to talk about that is as a ratio. So down to guard hair. If you look at the first check, a long guard hair, we would call that a closed fleece. It's got the guard hair. Huh? Oh,
I'm just here.
oh, okay. Let's see, where are we? Now, if a long guard hair in the first check, would call that a closed fleece, because you can't see the fleece, and that will protect the fragile down fibers, and that protection is significant. What if it's not protected, and if you have the second check, short guard hair that's even longer than the short guard hair, so the down bubbles out beyond the guard hair, you get a lot of down, but that kind of open fleece is exposed to environmental damage, particularly sunlight. And so when you run those open fleeces through the dehairing process and all the spinning and tumbling that goes on through that, what you end up with is a lot of breakage. And so there's a lot of fiber damage. Get Joe David going on that, and it's really interesting. So yes, there's a downside to just having too much exposed down. So there you go. We don't even score this. It's a breeder preference, and I'll show you what that means and why. So let's take a look. This is one of our goats, isn't it?
That's Blythe.
Oh, this is Blythe. Yeah, this is a really wonderful down underneath long guard hair. We would call that a silver goat. This is a short guard hair with the down bubbling out. We call that an open fleece. This is actually an Australian goat, and very typical of the Australian goat. And I think also from California there. This is pretty typical of the New Zealand goat too. If you've been have your goats been have guard hair that's shorter and have the down bubbling out like this?
They're half bred, so I have a buck that has luminous long hair and a buck that has. And my preference is the short, because it's really hard combing the longer haired ones, but they're so dense, I shear them. So I tend to trim the long hair before I shear them, so I don't have so much guard hair. I've already had my rotator cuff fixed once from combing all these years and
Okay, well, I'm glad you said that. Let's carry on and
Yeah. Okay,
talk a little bit about sorry about your rotator cuff, but I can imagine. Let's take a look at, before we get in, as part of explaining this, talk a bit about yield. Yield really is what comes out of your total fleece. So how much of the down comes out of whatever you harvested, whether you harvested by combing or by shearing. So let's take an example here on this second check down. If you shear something that's got long guard hair, you're going to, like you said, you're going to get an awful lot of that guard hair in your fleece. So once that comes through the processing and dehairing, you end up with something like 25% yield after all the waste, and which is mostly in this case guard hair, is removed. On the other hand, if you were to take that same goat and comb it, you would still get the same amount of down, but you wouldn't get the guard hair because most of the guard hair stays on the goat. So you'd get more like a 50% or 60% yield. So yield doesn't mean production. It just means a percent of the total fleece that you're going to actually get is down. And that's largely correlated to whether they have long guard hair or short guard hair and whether you shear them or comb them. Put that into, this isn't as complex as it looks really, but let's take that long guard hair goat we had, or one of yours. What is your first name? I have your husband's name or whatever on the, what is your name in California?
Barbara.
Barbara, okay, yeah. So I don't remember that. No, that's so. Barbara, here's a good example that might illustrate what you're doing. And hopefully your rotator cuff will get better.
Oh, no, it's fixed now.
Oh, good. Well, we don't need to fix it. But for others, long guard hair goat. That's one of those, the ones we just, so if you shear this goat, let's say you get 16 grams of shorn fleece. That was what we would call TFW, or total fleece weight. When you process this out, you're going to get about a 25% yield till you get 4 grams of down. So 25% of a shorn long hair will give you something like that. Now, if you comb this goat, you wouldn't get as much total fiber weight because most of the guard hair is going to stay on the goat. An average then would be something like 50%, maybe even more, 50 up to 60%, call it 50%, but you'd still get the same amount of down. You still get 4 grams. So 50% of 8 is 4, 25% of 16 is 4. So the same amount of down comes in. It just depends on whether you shear it or comb it as a strategy for harvesting. If you're going to have a long guard hair goat, you will get an awful lot of guard hair in there. So that's why most long guard hair goats, like this one, would be combed. There's ways of combing, and Wendy has produced a video on this and how to do it. But around the world, most cashmere really is combed. And in Texas, much like Australia, they really like the shear because they can do that. They know how to do it, and they would just line them all up and shear them just like they would Angora. However, they would have about twice as many. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Hey, hold it. I just made a mistake. These are not grams. I'm sorry. These are ounces. These are ounces. Wendy just corrected that. So let's talk. These are ounces. It's still the same percentage, but we should be talking about 8 ounces down to 4 ounces, 16 ounces down to 4 ounces. It's not grams, it's ounces. 1 ounce is 30 grams. So let's go back here. This animal, if you sheared it, you might want to do something like you're doing, Barbara, and that is cutting some of the waste first. If you comb the animal, though, you'll still get your 4 ounces,
Well,
just like you would if you sheared it.
yeah, I do it if I comb or shear if they're that long and they don't have the density of fiber.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I actually did hand pick from the same goat long time ago when I had more time on my hands. And it turned out that less than 1% of the weight of the fleece was guard hair if it was combed.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah.
so you can imagine what it is if you were picking a shorn fleece, it would take a long time.
Picking yeah, if you pick a combed fleece, yeah, you can actually get yourself up in the, well, I've never seen that good, but you can pick your fleece up to 80%. I've seen, but if you're picking it more than that, good for you.
Well, I was lucky. It happened to be a goat that had a little Toggenburg in it, and she was a black badger with a off-white fleece. Made it real easy to pick.
Wow. You want to sell her?
Oh, she's old gone.
Yeah.
This was in the 80s.
Okay, well, let's keep going and see if this fits what we're learning here. This goat just bubbling out, this down is much larger or longer than the guard hair. So, but if you shear this or if you comb it, you're still going to get your same amount. Let's say 4 ounces either way. But if you're doing that, it would come like this. If you comb it, you're still going to come around with the same amount of down, but on this one, you'd probably be getting more in the 50-60% if you don't pick it. So, summary, what happens if with a long guard hair goat, if you just want to do it like the rest of them in the world, these would largely be combed and keep the guard hair right on the goat. And you can expect something then like a 50% average. If you shear it, you're going to get something like 25% average return total down weight. But the down weight either way will be the same.
How do you tell when a long-haired goat is shedding? Because that was one of my problems. I couldn't tell when they were shedding because you couldn't see the hair coming off, and it would mat up into the long hair.
Yeah, but one of the ways to do that is to actually, as it gets to be shedding season, is to just run them through a visual inspection and look under the guard hair and give a little pluck and see if they're ripe. And when you're really, I don't know, when Wendy's dealing with these, I think you have maybe 3 or 4 combing sessions per goat. They might not all release all over their cashmere sites all at once. So you may have to go through several times on each goat. Does that make sense to what you're doing?
Yeah, I generally check that. Sometimes I'll let the neck go first or some other part. But as they're coming, I work on combing them.
Yeah, a visual check is probably what you would want to be doing. And then as you lift up the guard hair, just give a pull and get it before it gets all matted and ugly. Yeah.
Peter, we have one other question from Kathy Ashland, and then I think we're going to need to move on with the presentation. Kathy's got a good question. Can you address your question, Kathy?
Yep. Yeah.
She's muted.
Yeah, so my question was, why would we even use the percent yield as a value? It doesn't seem to have much importance if it doesn't affect the total amount. Why wouldn't you just use the total yield as the value instead of the percent yield?
Because it's not the, well, that's a good question. I'll show you why. You notice that it's not in the yield. Let me hold your breath here. We'll go back to this. the yield is not, you're right, it's not listed here. See where the yield is listed down here? It's the way you get to total down weight. So it's actually a part of the, it's really nothing more than part of the formula.
Okay, so yeah, so you're just using it as part of the formula, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what's being scored, because what's
Nope.
being scored is the total down.
Brilliant, perfect, exactly, hold that thought.
Okay,
That's
okay,
exactly
thank you.
right. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up, Kathy, is that we made it this way because yield would get confused with production. And sometimes volume gets confused with production, and production is total down weight. So we're trying to just re-understand some of those terms. So yeah, yield is nothing more than what you've got from a total fleece, and you inspect that total fleece, and you can give a good, reasonable, reliable estimate by eye is what the yield in that bag is going to be. Some people like Joe David and James Barton and Chris Lupton out in Texas were able to get somewhere without telling each other what they got. They could get within like maybe 2 to 3% of each other over time by just practice. So it's part of, you're right, Kathy, it's part of the formula for determining total down weight. Exactly. And it's an estimate. So mean fiber diameter. The best way to tell this is when it's plotted on a histogram. And this is through a laser scanner. Various Yoakum McCall, Texas A&M in the past have been doing this. We now have Texas A&M making these histograms available. We define it just the same way that it's defined internationally. It's 19 microns or less. Nothing special about that. If it's bigger, sometimes we call it Cashmere, but it's not Cashmere. The way we determine these is we tease out a sample of down from a sample. So we tease out a very small sample till we can actually see fibers, individual fibers in this small sample. That's what we would call a swatch. The swatch, this is how we get the swatch. Wendy and I spend most winter nights all night long till we run out of Guinness. But you could do this, you do this by eye, and you make your swatch, and then you can put it down and do things like measure it. And that's how you evaluate by eye any cashmere. The best way to evaluate it, however, is by eye, you're actually making an estimate of this kind of histogram. So this is a fiber diameter histogram. It's built on snippets and not on a staple. This is what the OFDA 2000 has at Texas A&M. It is really irrelevant to cashmere. On the other hand, they can make the OFDA 2000 run on the 100. They can do the 100 technique on it, do it in snippets, and still come out with histograms. So Texas A&M is doing some real work on making these histograms now available again. So these are histograms which show us the mean fiber diameter and uniformity, and it's nothing like the staple length histograms, which are really irrelevant to a dual-haired animal. And so this is what we're getting from Texas A&M now. Okay. We'll get into some histograms first, but before we do that, we should look at uniformity. Uniformity means not only, let's take here, not only do we have really fine fibers, our mean here is something like 16, the average fiber, that's the peak up here. But we're also looking for a curve that's fairly tight and steep. And that's what we would call uniformity, which means that the coefficient of variation is tight. It's less than 24%. So we'll show you some histograms here in a minute, show you what that means. But remember, we talked about transitional fibers. If you have transitional fibers, you're getting not only a broader curve, but your curve will be skewed. The shape of it will show us a curve that's skewed to the right. The reason for this is we're trying to get rid of transitional fibers out of all cashmere. Because once that gets in, those transitional fibers are somewhere in the 25 micron range. And when they hit skin, they'll prickle. They won't bend like cashmere will. So cashmere 19 or less will bend when it touches skin, but the 20 plus will tend to prickle. And that's why we call them prickle fibers, and we try to breed to keep those away. This is the thing that causes the prickle fibers is intermediates, and they have a mean fiber diameter somewhere around 25 microns, and they're also, they will make your histogram broad. I'll get to the histograms in a minute, but here's why this is important. This is the Gervinsakian goat that was brought in from Russia into Mongolia years ago to increase the production, the total down weight. And they did massive increases up to 200% of the total down weight. So this goat now is producing almost more than twice as much as it used to. However, what they also found, look here at these check marks, that the intermediate hair over here on the right, this is the Gervinsakian goat, 20% of that hair was intermediate fibers. So they increased the undercoat, they increased the down massively. But what they didn't do is keep track of the quality and the uniformity, not only the mean fiber diameter, but the uniformity of it. And they basically ruined most of the herd in Mongolia and had to be culled because they got just infected with transitional fibers because they weren't looking not just at mean fiber diameter, but they're only looking at that and production. They weren't looking at uniformity as well. So let's take a look and see what that means. Here's the histogram of the original Mongolian goat. And can you see this is a very steep, symmetric histogram. This is 14.6 mean fiber diameter with a CV of 20.7. Remember, under 24% is what you want. And under 19 microns is what you want. So you can see that this is a really nice fleece, cashmere. This is what happens when you get transitional fibers. See this second spike? That's what will skew the diameter histogram to the right, because it's hiding the second peak of transitional fibers. So when you see it skewed to the right, that's what the transitional fibers do. So you can see it by the shape as well as the CV. Let's take a look at some CVs from, some of these are from our farm. This is a 13 MFD with a CV of 17. This is beautiful. This is a wonderful fleece. This is about as good as you can get, as long as the production stays up. But that's an ideal fleece. Symmetric, steep, with no swing to the right. Here's another excellent fleece. So it's more like 13, still symmetric and steep. Not quite as steep as that, but that's real steep and real nice. As we go on, some of the goats will get older, or maybe not as good a goat. Now we're at 16.5. That's pretty much where you demarcate premium cashmere worldwide. 16.5 or less would be international premium cashmere. So this is right on the border of that, and it's also on the border of acceptable CV. It's starting to get a little broader than this one and broader than that one. So can you see how that it's not just mean fiber diameter we're looking at mean fiber diameter in the context of the shape of the curve. That's why uniformity is required to be 24% or less. and mean fiber diameter at the same time is 19 or less. It's not just the diameter, it's the uniformity as well. Here's where we start to lose uniformity, and we also start to lose MFD. This is probably a goat that's getting older as they thicken. And this one has got a 17 and a 23. This really is barely cashmere, and it's barely in the CV range as well. So any coarser, this goat would no longer have cashmere. And it can be a part of an aging process. As you keep going, it can get really bad. It's one of the worst I've ever seen. This came from our farm too. Interesting though, that this was the dog. You know, they say, do all goats have cashmere? Do dogs have cashmere? You'll see it sometimes called dog cashmere. Wait a minute. They do have an underdown, particularly northern dogs like Pyrenees, Huskies and Malamutes. They have some really nice underdown, and you can make hats out of it. But make no mistake, it's not cashmere. Anyway, we kept the dog. That's fine. So let's take a look now on if anybody are we okay with what mean fiber diameter is, what it looks like, and that uniformity also needs to go with mean fiber diameter. And the best way to do that is on a fiber diameter histogram.
Peter, we have one question, and I think it's actually a good question at this point in time.
Okay,
it's by
sure.
Paisley. Paisley, would you like to ask your question?
Go ahead, Paisley.
Hi, my question was, in a breeding program, just in your opinion, do you think that like the mean fiber diameter, the curvature, or the uniformity is like the hardest to breed in or out of a goat?
Well, I would say that mean fiber diameter and the curvature of style, that's what we're talking about here, and the next one, those are probably so closely correlated that you could use one or the other. So it's not exactly 100%, but it's more like 80% correlated. So style and mean and diameter pretty much go together. When you're looking at uniformity. Yeah, I think I would say the same thing too. As you lose your mean fiber diameter, you lose uniformity as well, particularly as they age. The exception to that is if you've got goats that are producing prickle fibers. Remember, we have that one hidden peak under the curve, and that was really a second peak. And what that peak was the prickle fibers. And so those are kind of hard to breed out. What they did in Mongolia, Chris McGuire went over there on a contract with the government. It was written up in Wild Fibers by Linda Courtwright. I think they had to cull almost something like half of the goats in their herd to get rid of those transitional fibers. They're the hard ones to get out. I don't know if you can even breed them out. But as far as simply mean fiber diameter and uniformity otherwise, yes, you can work those, I think, through your herd. Those prickle fibers, some have called it cashmere cancer. Once it gets in there, it's really hard to get rid of it.
Thank you.
Good question though. Let's bring us into style. We used to be able there, Texas A&M, maybe a decade ago was working with ways of measuring the degrees of an arc in a snippet. So over a millimeter. So if you had a millimeter here with a very broad curvature, you might get 35 degrees of an arc between here and there. If you had a very tight crimpy curvature, you're probably going to get more of that circle, or maybe 75 degrees of the curvature. So we were looking at ways of quantifying through an objective measurement just how many degrees of an arc you would get. That no longer is available. I hope that going forward we'll be able to work at that. Texas A&M was getting pretty close to making that work. The only way we can do style now, though, is through an eye exam, and you can do pretty good. I think when Wendy and I judge these fibers at a show, we sit across from the table from each other and you look at the same fleece and it's sort of like rocks, paper, scissors. Okay, ready? Okay, diameter, quick, lay it down. Style, lay it down. Length, lay it down. So uniformity, lay it down. And we find that we're about 95%. Very rarely do we have anything more than some 5% or less variation on what we do. Maybe that's because we work so hard during the winter. I'm just kidding. By the stove, grading these things. But I will tell you that you can do it by eye and be excellent. What they do in other countries, they do it mostly by eye, but they make their graders go back to calibrate with a histogram if they haven't been working for 2 weeks. You really do lose that eye. But if you're doing it often, you can pick up things like all these fiber traits. You can pick these things up by eye reasonably well, but it's never as good as a diameter histogram. This shows you that the crimp is very tight in real cashmere, and it's correlated to the diameter. Smaller diameters has more crimp, and it's three-dimensional. This produces the loft in a fleece and in a garment. The problem is we can't make that a requirement because there's no way to objectively measure it anymore. We thought we could at one point, and maybe we'll get back to there. But until we have an objective measurement, we'll keep it as a scored trait, but it's not required just to get in the registry. And you can score it accurately enough to be practical by eye. Differentiation, we do score that too, because when this fleece goes into the dehairing machine, there's a lot of tumbling and a process that's pretty, there's a lot of sort of carding type behavior that goes on, and then you blow air through it to get the cashmere to go at a different place than the guard hair, all that kind of thing. However, what you want is a differentiation that's really distinct. You would like to see your guard hairs kind of like human hair. And if you plot out a histogram, a fiber histogram, the diameter histogram, if you plot it out more, which you can do by special request, you might see something like this as the peak for cashmere and a peak way over here as differentiation. The reason is you really want to have a big differentiation. That means it spends less time in the machine and you come out with a cleaner, pure cashmere than it would if you're, say, the second peak was over here, because the machine has a hard time telling what's cashmere and what isn't. And that's what's sometimes called porcupine yarn. You'll run it through the dehairing machine, and you keep running it through and it's still got guard hair in it. And that's the reason, because the differentiation isn't adequate. Talk about length. We use a relaxed length in North American cashmere, and 32 millimeters or 1.25 inches. The reason for length, we're unique in worldwide. We're the only people probably, I think, I don't know if Australia does it. Okay, nobody else. And Wendy went to a conference in Italy with all the cashmere breeders from around the world and found that nobody else is got length in their cashmere. At the same time, this is a huge advantage when spinners are spinning, because you can do a whole lot more with 1.25 inches than you can with like a 3/4 inch. And it's hard to spin it when it's short. The other thing, over time, those short fibers will pull out of the yarn, and so that's called pilling. So would you buy that, Wendy? That's something that's pretty, you've noticed when you're selling yarn.
Yeah, you're really, that's why the Cashmere Goat Association, that is one of the requirements, is that in a relaxed state, it has to be 1.25 inches. Otherwise, it's quite hard to spin, whether you're a hand spinner or a machine.
Yeah. So how do we get length? We do have an objective way of doing it. You make a swatch, just like we were showing before, the same swatch, put it on a background, and the swatch we'll show you how to do that if you come to the one in August where we're doing on live. We run a fiber grading class, and after an hour and a half of this, you'll be able to make these swatches yourself and put a common ruler on it and measure your own down length. But if it goes from here to here, that's 1 5/8 inches. No more complex than that. It's kind of hard to learn how to make a swatch on a webinar, but we'll be doing a class in that in August, and you'll know how to make a swatch and how to grade by eye following that. Okay, next, almost done with this section. What did I just do? Hold it. All right, total down weight. This is what they were trying to get with a Curvensakian goat. Remember the one that lost its uniformity, had a huge 200% increase in total fleece weight and in the undercoat, what you would call down, but they forgot to look at things like uniformity. So they had all these prickle fibers, and I think Paisley, you asked her, Kathy, that those are really hard to breed out. The way you got rid of them, you got rid of the goat. That was tragic. So let's talk about total down weight. Total down weight is the goal, and we would love to see more total down weight. But the way you do that, can't remember who was asking. It was a good question. This is where percent yield is. Yield isn't a scored trait. What a yield is, what you look in the bag of the fleece, and a good eye, a practiced eye, can tell you within a couple percents of what the yield on that fleece is going to be when it goes through the dehairing and processing process. So you basically weigh your total down, shorn or combed, and then you estimate it from the percent that you estimate out of the bag, and that's where you get your total down weight. So yield is not the same as total down weight. Yield is just a way of getting to total down weight from the total fleece. Do you remember does anybody remember what it was? What's the average if you're going to shear a long-haired goat? What should you expect a yield to be on a shorn long hair? Anybody remember that? Does 25% sound close? Okay. If you're going to comb that same animal, comb the long guard hair, what would you expect for a yield on that if the guard hair is going to stay on the goat? Anybody like 50%? Okay, that's about right. I see some people trying to, I think there's a lag phase in the thing, but yeah, I think you're getting it. So total down weight, what we would like to see is we suggest 2 ounces of total down weight as kind of a minimum goal. And I think it's a pretty reasonable goal right now. On our farm, we're looking at 4 and 5 ounces of final total down weight cashmere, right?
Yeah.
Even more, 4 to 6, is what he says. And that's through combing. We comb all our goats now, and we get a yield of about 50, maybe 60%. But total down weight is what it is, and that kind of 4 to 6 is something that's good. That's good. What they did in Australia is they started culling ruthlessly by the numbers. They didn't name their goats, and they increased their production, like I think 300% over a 4 or 5 year period. Particularly the government was getting involved in standardizing this stuff, and they produced huge amounts of increased production just by breeding for it. What they also have, though, is a lot of that is the short guard hair, so that the down, as you saw before, bubbles out right beyond the guard hair. The only problem, if there is a problem, they still have good uniformity and no prickle fibers, but they do have fiber damage from sun. So some of that real nice down does have to break. If it's long enough, it breaks, you still have 1 1/4 inches, so that's fine. So total down weight comes through a process of yield, so 25% for a shorn long and 50% for a comb long. Good. Last thing we're going to look at is cover. Cover needs to be complete and consistent. The reason for this is you don't, well, because if you don't breed for a consistent cover, where you might find is that on, say, the shoulder, side, and rump, you've got real nice cashmere, but on the neck, you might have something that isn't cashmere at all. It might be called cashgora. And we found that some of early on when we were putting together a cashmere herd, that was not uncommon. The other thing that was not uncommon is you could find goats that had long guard hair, but they only had cashmere, say, on their side, and they didn't have any on their butt or on their chest, on their shoulder, or even on their neck. It wasn't complete. It didn't go around the goat. When we were evaluating goats years ago, a lot of the evaluation was done with well, no, that's not relevant. I think a complete fleece on a goat would be something you could only look at in the live goat. There's no way you're going to get that out of a bag. And you can only do it in the winter. Like in a show that we have maybe in October, you're really not going to have your cashmere on the goat. So we found that early on, there was a lot of incompletes. But you couldn't do that at the show. The only way you do that is at a farm evaluation, doing your own or doing somebody else's farm, and you have to do it in the season when they got cashmere. However, this whole idea of a consistent fleece is valuable enough to score it, whether even if it's from a bag. So what we do is go into a bag of fleece and take a minimum of 4 grabs from different parts of the fleece somewhere in the evaluation here and lay them out and compare one to the other. And if they look like the same quality right on through, that gets a good consistent score. 3 is the best. If the neck is cashgora and the butt is short or they're different, then they get an inconsistent score. And so they would get a bad score on consistency. And that's really, that's why it's scored, but it's not a required trait because there's no real objective way to measure that. So this is a summary of what we've just done. You can see here that color and the length of the guard hair are breeder preferences. We don't require, that's not scored, but you would want to know it if you're grading somebody's cashmere on their farm or you're grading your own. And I'd like to, I would hope that we would bring back more of these on-farm evaluations, because those were hugely important to us in the early days of getting a good cashmere herd going. So we've talked about diameter, uniformity of length of being required, and then things like style, differentiation, and total down weight and cover as being scored and put in the database so people buying and selling goats, but they're not required. So next time we'll talk about the conformation scores and some of the conformation things like condition and frame that we don't require or even score, much like the same ways with fiber. So Wendy will be doing that for you next month.
Peter, Paisley has another really good question, so I'm going to let her ask that.
Paisley always has good questions.
So when we're talking about those like prickle fibers that are intermediate and like really dangerous for fleece quality,
yeah,
have those been seen yet in the United States, or is that more of like something? And could they appear if you just don't bother to continue to care about uniformity, or is that something that would be more of concern if we brought in goats from another country?
Another good question. Wow. How long have you been thinking about that one? I think it doesn't matter which country they come from. You can import goats But I think that's why multiple factors in combination are what a standard is all about. So I think what I would say is that if a goat doesn't come in with prickle fibers, no matter where it comes from, if it's still, you would still look at its fiber histogram. And I'd get a fiber, if I was importing goats or even breeding goats, our breeding bucks, we would measure a fiber histogram or a diameter histogram every year. And that's $15 to do it. But if you really want to get a program started, I really would recommend that will take away all of your problems. Go get a $15 histogram, at least on your bucks. And you can do a histogram by eye if you got somebody around who can do that. But I think that it's not where they come from, it's what they got when they come here. If they don't have it, if they don't have prickles when they come, they're probably not going to get them. What happened with the Russian German goat is they weren't even looking at things like uniformity or even diameter. They were just looking for the fuzzy undercoat and massive amounts of it. So if you look at all of the seven traits in combination, you can move goats around country to country. But I would tell you, I think we've got enough really good breeding stock in the United States and Canada that you really don't have to go overseas and go through all the international headaches that people used to have to do in the past.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Okay, I get histograms with everything that I have tested.
Good.
And in my mohair, they do the same OFDA 2000, but they calibrate it for mohair, and they give me the comfort factor. The prickle factor is also that part of the comfort factor, because colored mohair a lot of times has kemp, and that's what you're talking about, those prickle factor fibers in the mohair. And I've been breeding that out because when they started breeding colored Angoras, they used goats with cashmere, regular goats, not cashmere goats, but regular goats, to get the color, until they found that they could do that. The white breeders were going to sell you bucks that they discovered had a color gene in them instead of killing them when they were babies. They can do that now. And all of my cashmere comes back as 100% comfort factor. The thing is that when they calibrate, from what I understand, it's the machine doesn't register anything over 30 microns and over. So if there is any kemp in the cashmere, then that would be 25 microns, and that would get by the machines, and then you'd have a different type of thing if they recalibrated it for that. And so far in the cashmere, I haven't seen that, and everybody comes up 100% comfort factor. I have merino that gets 99%. I have some Angora kids and yearlings that are up to in the 90% range. So I'm kind of going on that too, as well as the other values that I'm trying to figure out in mohair that nobody has knows what they're doing with. And
well, I would tell you this, though. It's a good point to bring up. But to Kat Paisley, I think it was an asset. One of the problems that we have seen in the past when they tried to mix Angora with cashmere, and you end up with something called Cashgora, and they did have a lot of transitional fibers happen there. And again, that Cashgora has become kind of a bad thing for cashmere. I think if I was trying to start a herd now, I would absolutely look at something that's registered in the North American Cashmere Goat Registry and look at their scores and breed off of that. I certainly wouldn't try to breed something like Angora with cashmere.
Oh, I never do.
Oh, good for you. That's a good example.
We
Don't
did
ever
have
do-
an accident and I was illustrating because I have
Okay,
a doe that is definitely Cashmere, but she's a cashmere goat. Not
Okay.
crossed with an Angora.
yeah,
But I did have an accident and I didn't figure it out till it was partially grown.
I get you. Oh, that would be
We
cool.
have,
There's 2 different kinds of Cashmere, and that's something that I illustrate to people when I'm telling them about cashmere.
Somebody else wants to-
Okay,
Peter, we have a couple other people in line, which is some good
Okay, go ahead.
questions. And one, I'm gonna ask Jane, who is one of our former judges. She just wanted to make a note that I thought was worthy for the class, or for folks to
okay,
know.
go ahead.
Jane?
Is this Jane Deerdorf?
It is.
Oh, wow, all right.
If not, I can read what she wrote.
Oh, why don't you read it?
I'll read it. She said, I think it needs to be addressed that the amount of vegetation matter in the fleece will also affect the amount of the final yield. She said, just VM
Oh,
sometimes
yes,
in a, as far as if we're weighing.
absolutely, absolutely. When you're looking at waste, we're kind of calling guard hair part of the waste. So it's anything that's not cashmere. So yes, that is exactly true. It's not just the guard hair, it's the
Yeah.
other stuff in it, right?
And then Stacy has a question. Stacy, would you like to jump on and ask your question?
Yeah, my question was about fiber diameter and uniformity. Is there an average rate of decline that you expect to see as a goat ages? Like, how would you tell this one is way worse than average? It's already gotten terrible by 4, whereas this one's holding up well and it's 11.
Yeah, I'll let you, Wendy talks about that. She's sitting right here.
Hi, sorry, I was in another
Swing
meeting.
over here.
Just swing over here. He said. What I found
Put your face.
working,
See it.
what I found working with our critters is that the ones that start, a lot of them that start at really, really fine, like 13, 14 microns, don't tend to coarsen particularly, and they hold that fiber through their lives. And that's really helpful for me in judging others, because I can take samples from them to help me do an eyeball comparison. I found with bucks, I watch for the second year. And when the second year, if the first year, say they're 13 or 14, next year they're 16, I'm almost guaranteed that by 3 or 4, they'll be 20 microns. And so it's kind of trying to watch it as you go. And I've generally had my animals have always every single year had them tested. And I've found that continuity, some animals just hold their fiber. Some animals, when they're older, start to get a little bit finer as well. And I'm not sure if that's an age factor or what.
I mean, finer or,
Finer.
oh,
I mean, I'm talking 11, 10, 11, when I'm talking about age. So there is some differentiation, but I think the thing that's worked the best for us is getting every single animal evaluated every year, either by a farm visit, which is wonderful, or by going through Texas A&M, who are now doing the snippets, or send them to New Zealand, who bought the Yoka McCall machinery. And we've just made a lot of breeding decisions based on what we get back, because we've wanted to develop the really fine cashmere.
So you might know by 2 then that this animal's not going to hold up.
you get some sense of that, yeah. I think that's what we've been testing. Wendy makes a good point, and that might help you, Stacey, is that if you're really trying to get a breeding program started, I would start with a fewer animals, real good ones that have scores in the registry. You know what you're getting, and you can. I know Wendy's been managing a lot of this herself, is you can actually breed goats that will hold their cashmere right into 7 and 8 years old. That's kind of unusual, but you can breed for that. How's that? The other thing I think, we've always done this with bucks, a breeding buck can, I think it's well worth the $15 a year to get a breeding buck with a diameter histogram every year. And then you'll see when he starts to cashmere out. But I think that the rate at which they coarsen over time is genetic. There's a couple other things I promised I would look at here at the very end. Can you see the difference between volume and total down weight? Sometimes we use the term loosely in the past. Well, what's the volume? What's the volume that goat gives? Volume is nothing more than volume. It has nothing to do with total down weight. The way a fleece is managed, or you can fluff it up or unfluff it up. Volume is volume. Weight is weight, and total down weight is not the same as volume. Volume is just an inaccurate way of trying to get to production. A total down weight can be called production, but volume isn't production. Yield also isn't total down weight. Yield is just a way of looking at what percentage of your bag, including guard hair and foreign material, will come out through the processing. So it's just a way of getting a percentage of what's in the bag of a fleece that'll turn into total down weight. So yield doesn't mean production either. It's just a part of the formula. On handle, this is one of the terms that gets bounced around, and we've actually had done some experiments with this and try to get experts who can you tell a good fleece from feeling it. And it's kind of interesting that you can't. Handle is not really dependent on good fleece. So a nice soft fleece doesn't really mean anything. The other thing is handle in a raw fleece is affected by things like guard hair. So the guard hair in a fleece is not soft. So we've actually done a couple little experiments with evaluation, and people who wanted to use handle is something we would evaluate, but we found that it has no correlation at all with accurately defining good cashmere. Luster is another term that you may have seen that. That's kind of an old-fashioned term that really is not good in cashmere. In fact, where luster came from mostly is when breeding cashgoras through angoras mixed with cashmere, you get a whole lot of down, but a lot of it became ununiform, and a lot of it had prickle fibers. But what it also had was luster. So you can kind of see cashgora, which is the term kind of used for that experiment, and you can see that it has kind of a sheen to it. That is not a good thing. So a lot of the cashgora experiments, in particularly like Australia, have pretty much been stopped. On an open or closed fleece, just real simple, an open fleece is like that Australian goat we saw that had fluffy down coming up through past the guard hair, and a closed fleece is a fleece that the down is shorter and the guard hair covers the down. So any additional questions are good, but I want to make the point that this isn't just about questions. This is about comments, corrections, suggestions, or anybody has any other good ideas. It's not about questions.
On that, in the 80s, when I first started in with cashmere goats and didn't have any way of testing except sending it to Australia, I knew about the luster thing. And so any yearling first fleece, or any first fleece that she was walking around with a straight and shiny neck, they got sold.
Good.
And
Good.
so I kind of judge it that way. And some of my really old goats that have held up well will keep that lusterless and crimpy neck. And I really value those.
Okay, good. Well, Wendy has a comment on that.
I just,
Get over something.
no, I'm fine. I don't have to. Yes, dear. What I've found over the years is that by having my goats evaluated, their fiber evaluated every year, I learned an awful lot. And I had a buck who, at 3 years old, 4 years old maybe, he was 20 microns and he had the most beautiful style. And it was harder than heck to let go of him, but I did, because if we don't have the microns, we're not quite there. And what I've learned is I have some goats who their first fleece is 13.6 and their 11th fleece. David has some of this fiber that he's using in his judging, and it's still 13.6. And so in that, I try to run with that. And I think it's a little bit hit or miss when you bring in a buck from outside, and it's really important if you evaluate it that you can learn that is a winning thing for you in developing your herd and having it be really high quality. But I have found that animals, if they hold it in 2, 3, 4 years, they're likely to hold that quality all the way through their lives. And I'll bet you that Barbara's found that too.
Well, one of the things.
But I don't keep them long enough.
Okay, well, I think somebody was asking about what kind of traits can get bred into something or not. I mean, prickle fibers are hard to breed out, but I would agree with Wendy there that there's a lot of, there's some genetics in being able to hold your fiber
That's big.
through the aging process, where most animals will coarsen over time. If you can find bucks that are still running good cashmere in the 17, 16 at the age of 8, that's a buck that needs to be bred.
Needs to be collected so other people can buy that semen.
Yeah,
Oh,
And this is what I'm gonna do with mine. I'm gonna have them collected.
yeah,
good for
yeah,
you.
yeah. That should be interesting.
Oh, hey, it's a lot of fun. I've been doing it for years.
Have you really?
Yeah, and I even do Angora goats, but there aren't very many good Angora bucks out there that I really want to buy.
Yeah.
So I'm getting stuck.
Mm.
Is Joe David?
Well, no, I don't think so.
Is Joe David by any chance participating?
No, he is not tonight. Joe David is not on, but I will tell the folks who are participating, besides this particular program, there are others on the CGA YouTube with Joe David talking about fiber analysis as well. So, but he is not on tonight, Wendy.
Thank you. If you're combing, I got a little combing one that a friend of mine did named Russell Lane.
Yeah.
So you can look at that. It's not about the quality of the fiber, it's about gathering it. It's kind of fun. Oh, I thought it was fun.
Okay, well, that's where we stop here. And I think the next stop on this train would be a month from now or so. We're doing confirmation just like this. And then in October and August, that's when we've had people at the farm. We'll be doing live. So that's where we'll actually learn to do your own fiber evaluations. And on confirmation evaluations, we're learning things like one of the best ways to learn about feet is to trim them. So we're going to have a lot of feet for trimming, and you'll be a good foot trimmer once you get out here, but you also learn the genetics of feet.
Peter, there's just a few other questions. Actually, Pam, who's also a CGA judge, has a question. Pam, do you want to jump on? This is Pam Marshall.
Oh, yeah, Pam.
Yeah.
Hi, Pam.
Hi. Hey, I was just wondering if the North American Cashmere Registry is requiring periodic fiber data to show if a buck or a doe, for that matter, holds their fiber or not.
It's not requiring it, Pam, but it would be a good idea. If I was buying or selling, I would want to see some, if not annual, more than one evaluation.
Or current one.
It's, yeah, at least something current, right? It's not a requirement, but it's a good idea. That's why some things are required, but some things are still in the registry as scored. So if I was buying and selling, I would not be spending a whole lot of time on something like a buck that didn't have some sort of current diameter histogram. Good question, though.
And there's another question, Jane, let's see if Jane can hop on this time. She's also a CGA judge, has a question about color.
All right.
Jane's calling from out near Washington. Jane, I don't know if I'm understanding this question right, but I'll try to do my best to read it. She said, is there any feeling on a goat that has have different colors in the fleece? I think maybe she's talking about, you know, the color affecting the fiber, if you've noticed that. Wendy, you're on mute.
Well, I'm at the same spot as Peter. Am I still on mute?
Nope, you're good now.
Okay. Well, I think the thing about color is that there may be several different colors on a goat. And I think that means it's not going to be white, which is one color, and it's not going to be dark brown, which is the other. So the thing about taupe gives you lots of room. And that's where I think I would go with a goat that had multiple colors, because when it gets processed, that's all going to get blended together. Does that make sense?
So there's no preference. It doesn't matter if a goat has spots of white as far as the goat registry.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Actually, it's a good question though, Jane, because we looked at that pretty carefully and, you know, tried to get a consensus whether if people wanted to put color, and found that it really was practically not particularly useful to worry about it. It's either dark brown, white, or taupe. So.
Is that helpful?
Thank you.
I have a doe with a tan slash downer and the fiber is still white underneath it. So yeah, the only one I have that's multicolored.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I think that concludes our program, and time has gone pretty fast, Peter.
Wow.
Fit a lot in. The actual next date that you'll be receiving the link for is going to be on Conformation with Wendy, and some great pictures of Conformation, good and bad. And that's going to be on June 29th. And then the Eventbrite page that you'll get sent to you as well will be for the culminating event, which will take place in August at their farm in Springtide in Bremen, Maine. So there'll be more information on that coming out. But Peter, I want to thank you for the presentation, super informative, and everybody will receive this program.
Hey, can I say something?
Sure.
I just want you to know that Peter's doing this evening, and today he received from the state of Maine an appreciation for his work in what do you call it?
Medicine.
He says medicine, but what he has developed over the years is, what do you do if you're somebody driving along and there's a car wreck in front of you? And he teaches critical care training to people like, I don't know if you have Life Flight in your state, but we have, you know, helicopters that head to the scene. And he's been over the years training both people that take people on canoe trips or mountain climbing, or they come in a wreck and they got to know how to help save somebody's life. And so they gave him an award today. And the award he got today was thanking him for all he's contributed to emergency medical services in the state of Maine, and actually wider all over the world. But it was an amazing thing for me to see him get that appreciation for that award. And I just can't help, you know, commenting on it, because he was so humble about it. Everybody else, no, there have been 3 people ever have gotten this award in the state of Maine, and there were 2 people today, and they're going to get their names edged in this granite thing. And I'm kind of like saying, well, at least I'm glad he's not dead to get this award. But I think he was so excited about this, he wanted to get in the car and come home. And
well, I wanted to get home to do this. You know, I couldn't stay. I wanted to come home and get this webinar. This has been a great opportunity to kind of, after all these years, I've met many of you in the judging process and all that. And I think that this is kind of a good opportunity just to clean up some terms and to clean up some some directions. I hope to see when we do this thing in August, what we've done in the past is there's a lobster bake down at my sister-in-law's right on the shore. So we'll have our grading class and our confirmation class and go to the Atlantic Ocean and eat lobster. So we hope to see some of you then too. So.
Thank you, everyone who signed up for tonight and supporting CGA with this program. And we hope that you continue to follow us. And I think we're more active than ever in educating about cashmere and cashmere goats. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Okay, you guys.
Thank you,
Good night.
Peter.
Okay, thanks for your help with all this, Christine.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good
Still
night.
daylight here.